Rachel Reeves announced her long-awaited spending review last Wednesday. We'll be reflecting on what that might do in terms of Labour's polling fortunes. And Keir Starmer announced that there's going to be a national inquiry into grooming gangs. Why did he wait so long? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. And, this week we have Kevin Johnson, our man in Birmingham from Urban Comms, joining us alongside Joe Phillips, because the AI holograph that is Jim Hancock has run out of electricity. We forgot to plug him in over the weekend, and so hopefully he'll be back with us next week. But we've got a more than adequate stand-in in Kevin. Great to see you, Kevin.
Good to see you, Frank. Good to see you, Joe. Good morning.
Morning.
Nice. And what we thought we'd talk about, of course, to kick off, is that spending review, that much awaited spending review that Rachel Reeves announced on Wednesday, and looks as though she's almost put all of her eggs in the NHS basket, although, of course, she did have to find a significant amount of cash for defence. To her credit, though, I think that she's put some decent money into what we will describe as longer term investments, infrastructure projects. Finally, we're going to get a nuclear power station built. Very welcome news in terms of some of the regional rail links that were announced, road improvements. Basically, what she's trying to do is front end a lot of that infrastructure stuff in order to boost the economy. And of course, there was £39 billion in there for housing as well. So I'll start with you, Joe. What did you make of Rachel Reeves's announcement on Wednesday?
Well, certainly more upbeat than she has been of late. I think she is always going to be dogged by, as we've said before, the absolute catastrophic way they dealt with scrapping the winter fuel allowance, and that's going to hang around her neck like an albatross forever. But I think, this investment is great. It's absolutely what's needed. But what's really important is that people begin to see it, that it doesn't just disappear into a black hole. And we've talked about this before, Frank, particularly when it comes to the NHS. Yes, you can pour money into the NHS until there's no money left. But unless you fundamentally change it and get some reform, which Wes Streeting has not extracted from the doctors when he settled the pay dispute last year. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of movement. There's a lot of talk, but not a lot of movement. And actually, you've got to be digital, and it's got to be universal. And we've got to do something about preventative healthcare, which means healthy lifestyles, which means better housing, which means cleaner air, which means school dinners, etc., etc. And the whole thing about getting people back to work. And I think, I've said it often, but they still have not even mentioned social care. And that is the elephant in the room in terms of local government funding and the drain on the NHS because of the problems that you get not being able to discharge people from hospital. But overall, I thought it was okay. It was upbeat. But, as we have seen since then, and we'll talk about that in tomorrow's podcast, events, dear boy, events can overtake you. And we have seen the price of oil go through the roof, which will then have an impact on everything else.
Yeah, well, you can't blame the Chancellor for everything, and you certainly can't blame the Chancellor for that. She can only do what she can do in terms of a day job. And Kevin, I'm with Joe. I thought it was far more upbeat, optimistic. Labour MPs were certainly happy with it, more happy than they have been during most of their time in government over the past 12 months. What was your reflections on it?
Yeah, it's only better, and they are doing the right thing, because for too long we've lived in a world where the short term rules, and we all know that this country needs fundamental rebuilding in many ways, both literally and not so literally, and doing the things that they're doing, whether it's in transport, in defence, and all the other infrastructure improvements, which we'll hear a lot more about this week. That is all the right thing. We may just have doubts about delivery, might we? We're going to get an update on HS2, which is going to interest us on this podcast in particular later this week. And you just worry a little bit about those extra millions, indeed billions, are going to be spent, and is that going to be efficient ways of delivering that investment? That aside, the problem is then left is twofold, isn't it? One is, what in the budget makes you feel better? Or in the spending review, I should say, Freudian slip. What makes you feel better? And I'm not sure there was a message there too much to kind of keep you going in the short term until the long term pays off. And I think she's just going to be dogged, I'm afraid, now until the budget, when it comes later in the year, about tax, because the room for manoeuvre, not least with events terrible, as you've both talked about, and price of oil, and the rest of the impact of Israel, Iran, and everything else going on in the world. I think we all know that tax rises are coming. She may be able to avoid putting them on the three main taxes, which is committed to in the manifesto, but tax rises in some way are coming, which I'm personally not against. We need to reinvest back into this country, but she's left herself a bit like with the winter fuel allowance. She's left herself this room, which is just going to be filled with sort of conjecture and people saying we told you so, and just sort of speculation building up to when that budget comes. But Labour is doing the right thing, which governments of the last few years have not been doing. Boris had a lot of talk about it, but the money didn't follow. And so we should applaud her for making long-term investments, which is what government should be doing. But the short term is tricky.
Yeah, and that's the problem that politicians have, don't they? They've got a relatively short period of time in office, 4 to 5 years. Some would say these days, a bit like being a football manager, being a politician. You don't even get that, do you? She's been in office a year, and she's already obviously got a major headache in terms of that winter fuel allowance decision that she made early in her tenure. And then, as you've rightly said, Kevin, we've now got a few months before the budget where there's going to be lots and lots of speculation about how she fills some of these potential black holes along the way. And that was the problem, I think, for this government from the off-go, because we had such a long period before she did her first budget that it allowed all the speculation, it allowed all that conjecture. And of course, by the time she stood up at the dispatch box, the narrative that had been created was the country was going to hell in a handcart. And of course, she partly created that. Now she's trying to be a bit more upbeat. But as you rightly say, because of the way in which these fiscal events are coming around, she's never, I don't think, as Chancellor, been ahead of the narrative. She's always following. And it was difficult even for Darren Jones, who's one of Labour's better performers, to try and push back on we don't know what's going to be happening in October, because of course what people from your professions want is answers. And so saying, we'll have to wait and see, just doesn't cut it in the modern media era, if it ever has. So there is a challenge there for them. And I just wonder, Joe, from a communications perspective, how Labour does start to take credit for longer term thinking, for a strategic approach, because that has been long missing from the UK. It's got to be at least part of the reason why we find ourselves bobbing along in terms of lack of economic growth, lack of investment into public services and infrastructure. How do they start to get some credit for that?
Well, they've got to start telling the story, and they've got to start doing it very locally, so that every single Labour MP can say, hang on a minute, this is happening in this constituency, whether it's something little, whether it's refurbishing a park, or whether it is giving extra money to keep a swimming pool open, or whether it is free school meals for kids at that primary school. You've got to start doing it. And I know if Jim was here, he and I both feel very strongly about local media, and particularly local newspapers, which have pretty much disappeared. and local radio. People increasingly don't know what's going on in their local area, but actually they know what's going on in their street. But they've got to start telling the story, and they need to get people out who are good at communicating. Actually, Angela Rayner, hello. You know, one of the problems that you've just both identified with Rachel Reeves is that she hasn't got this sort of political nous. And if you put that with Keir Starmer, who neither has got the political sort of intuition, you've got these really dull people saying, well, we'll wait and see. Well, what we've waited and seen is, never mind unemployment going up, we've actually seen more damaging, I think, the vacancy rates really dropping, which means that employers are reluctant to take people on because they're waiting to see. Well, you know, if you're running a small business, whether it's a hairdresser or a pub or whatever it is, you can only wait and see for a little while, and then you think, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And then there's another shop closed in the high street, and that is their problem. They need to be saying, well, you know, what have they done since they came into office? Actually, then show us the rubbish that you've cleared. Use it like fly tipping and say, this is what the last government spent money on. Did you get any benefit? This is what the last government didn't spend any money on, you know, filthy, overcrowded prisons, etc., etc. This is what we're doing. And it is a little bit like thinking about campaigns that work on stuff like littering or, you know, taking a plastic bag to the, not using plastic bags, all of those sort of things. You've got to take people with you, but at the moment they don't feel like they're with us. And so the job for Labour MPs has got to be, right, tell me what's happening in my area so I can tell my constituents.
You're pushing back against a huge, I've never seen a government take as much stick from the press.
Oh, it's awful. It's terrible, Frank. I've never...
You've got that battle, haven't you, Kevin, in terms of not having a what we would call mainstream media these days with you. And then we've long talked on this podcast or disagreed about the BBC's role in the rise of reform, but we won't get into that this week. But they, all that being said, they don't seem to have a lot of natural communicators, and it's certainly not the Prime Minister, it's certainly not the Chancellor, and that seems to me, Kevin, to be the main problem, because unless you have people at the top who can tell that story, who can engage with the electorate, who can actually say, yeah, things are going to look great until years 3, years 4. And actually, Starmer had a phrase during the early days of his premiership, and indeed during the election campaign, we're going to start to put building blocks in place that will improve the country. Now, it seems to me that they've started to do that, but he stopped using that phrase. And I just wonder whether sometimes they haven't got good communications advice around them, because, of course, although they may think, oh, we're saying this all the time, it takes a long time for those sort of messages to sink into the psyche of the electors. So I do also wonder, and this was from a conversation I had with someone fairly senior in the Labour Party, when we were talking about how you can get some consistent messaging into the government and coming from Keir Starmer. He felt quite badly stung by the, do you know my dad is a... Was he a... I mean, even I've forgotten now. You said
he's a toolmaker, Frank. Everybody knows he was a toolmaker, man.
So he feels quite... So that repetitiveness that we would often advise politicians to utilise as a tool, if I pardon the pun, he's shied away a little bit from that. But Kevin, listen, you are, you know, amongst many of your other skills, you have this ability to communicate a message. You've dealt with politicians and tried to get them onto a platform where they can start to tell those stories. What would you be saying to the government now?
Well, I thought two things are interesting that I picked up in the last week since the spending review, and you may have both listened stroke read these things. One was there are other podcasts as well as this one. I don't know if you know that, but another good one is Political Currency with Ed Balls, George Osborne. I thought they nailed. I mean, that's obviously after you finish listening to this podcast, that's worth a listen to get their take, because their take is broadly similar, at least in terms of the political messaging of it, as in what was the political message. As the Times described the Reeves spending review, it was a sort of a budget without a theme. And I think that we can all detect what the theme is, because that's what we sort of, the three of us do, and a lot of other people can. But really, if you're sort of looking at it in glancing and seeing some headlines, you don't really determine a theme from it. And I think that's right. Some other interesting things, other observations they make, which I think is right, which is there's a lot of I in Rachel Reeves's address to the Commons when she was presenting the spending review, which is in a way a bit of a risk when you use more I's than you do we's. And the other thing I've just finished reading is the New Statesman in-depth profile of Starmer, which is very good, and I do recommend a good read of it. And what comes out of it really, along with Rachel Reeves, is, as we sort of know these things anyway, that they're sort of managers and fixers. They're not storytellers. They're not great communicators. They're, in Starmer's case in particular, a man of who believes fundamentally in human dignity is the sort of greatest, ideology that comes out of that those interviews that make up that profile piece, and a man of family, etc. And he's really a sort of a stop the chaos merchant, which we might all pretend that we want. Now, we all secretly enjoyed the Brexit years and all the sort of chaos of Liz Truss, etc., has gone on, because it's kept us talking and sort of kept us all in business in one way or another. But we pretend to want to stop the chaos. But really, in a way, you sense a nation which is sort of missing, in a way, Boris Johnson, because whatever you think of him, he could communicate and he could, get a slogan across. And I won't dwell on it for too long, Frank, because I think you ranted about him last week quite a bit. But, Farage, is probably the greatest political communicator in this country since Tony Blair. And we can all break down the reasons for why that is. So we need storytellers, and Starmer, I think, could be better. I think if some people got hold of him, he could be a lot better. But I think to come to your question, really, Frank, one is I think he's got to use his lieutenants better. Which Joe's already touched on. Darren Jones is a very good communicator, but he does slip up, as he did last week on Question Time, and he did a few weeks back. But we're all human; we all slip up. Wes Streeting, I think, is a good communicator, but at the same time can look like he's running for the leadership a bit too early. Peter Carl, I think, is a good communicator.
Yeah.
But the other set of communicators I'd use, which sort of comes to Joe's other main point, which is use the mayors more and use good local politicians, good MPs, good backbench MPs. I don't know, the sort of Stella Creases of this world, etc. I think he's got to make more use of those people to sell those local / regional stories, which might be a bit more of the day to day, because clearly Starmer is going to, he's in Canada as we record this podcast. He's going to spend an awful lot of time, as many prime ministers end up doing, on the international stage, which he'll get a lot of flack for, but he's going to have to do, particularly now with all that is going on, be that trade or wars or whatever, energy, etc. He's going to spend, probably 50% of his time either abroad or on foreign affairs matters. So I think he's got to trust his lieutenants a little bit more and get a better balance between the day-to-day, some of which Joe's touched on, and, as you say, Frank, the building blocks. Just to finish on this point, I agree with you. They're getting a pretty rough ride, really, given what's gone before. That this government is trying to at least administer government in a decent way, with ethics and all the rest of it. I'd like them to do a lot more on constitutional reform, on sort of ethics in government, but they're doing it in the right kind of way. They're putting in long-term planning and long-term investment, whether that's about AI, about defence, about health, about rail, etc., social housing. They're doing all the right kind of things, but I'm afraid they're not going to get credit for those for another year or two at the very earliest. So they've got to get the balance between day to day and the long term in terms of the political messaging, and he's got to use his lieutenants a bit better, I think.
Let me just dig into one of the comments that you made there, Kevin, about the country not really wanting stable government. And it's almost bizarre to say it, but you do sense that just total disconnect these days between our main political parties. The Tories are absolutely in the gutter at the moment, and the electorate. And so almost anything that comes along, bit of a magpie that's looking for the shiny silvery stuff, are getting a boost in terms of the polls. And as you rightly say, Kevin, Farage is a master at sort of finding out what those issues are and honing in on them. I'm almost at the point where I think it doesn't matter what a government does if it's run by a Starmer or a Sunak. We're actually in a situation where the electorate are just going to roll the dice every time they get a bit fed up. That's what happened with Brexit. It's what happened to an extent with Boris Johnson. And if you look at the polling from Conservative Home, which sadly I watch very carefully every week, Boris Johnson is currently leading those polls amongst Conservative members. So are we almost saying it doesn't matter what Starmer and Reeves do over the next 4 years, because actually the country's in that place where they're just going to kick him out anyway and say, go on, Nigel, you give her a go now. Is that where we are?
I think part of that is right. I think there is a huge disconnect, although I would argue that a lot of the disconnect stems from many people who voted for Brexit and believed the lies that Boris Johnson told them, and the way he then behaved during COVID and the pandemic and everything else, and and the chaos that followed. That people just, they've got enough to deal with. They just turn their backs on it. They're bored. It's like a soap opera where you think, actually, I've just given up watching this. Or you slightly fall out of love going to watch your club on a Wednesday night in November, when they're battling to stay up in the championship. And you think, actually, I can't commit to this anymore. I'm just going to concentrate on something else. And I think that's part of the problem. I think we are, however, in extraordinarily, unprecedentedly dangerous times globally and unstable times globally. So whilst Keir Starmer might not be cutting the mustard at home, I think he's doing a really good job abroad, and he has brought a certain stability. He's given Britain back a voice. He's put us back around the negotiating table, whether that's with Europe or, the G7 or with Trump or whoever. And I don't think those things can be ignored. People, in the street don't notice it because they're more concerned about jobs, money, pensions, etc. But actually, if you wanted a prime minister to lead the country as we go on to a war footing, as the Sunday Times said yesterday, frankly, I'd rather have Keir Starmer than Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch or Nigel Farage or anybody, frankly. But I do think, and again, on the international thing, he has had to spend a lot more time on international affairs than he might have expected to because of what's happening around the world, which then slightly begs the question, what's the role of the Foreign Secretary? And the other thing, that all the time he's over there, there are an awful lot of people coming over here, and the immigration problem is going to get worse. I mean, this weekend, here I am in Kent. It's been sunny. It's been calm. Another 900 people yesterday. And that is going to become, not just an albatross. It's going to be a dead whale on a beach. It's awful. And until they can get a grip on that, Farage has got something to beat them with. So is the Daily Mail and the Telegraph. And, you can't battle against all the papers being against you, but you can do it, at a better level. And you've got to get your MPs fired up. And, you've got peers, for goodness sake, you've got Jackie Smith in the House of Lords on skills. Well, get her out talking about the new apprenticeships, because then the building of these homes and these infrastructures becomes real, because you can say, well, our Kevin's got an apprenticeship. He's going to be working on that, whatever it is.
Yeah, they're not using enough personalities, I don't think. You have got some good communicators. The point you make about mayors is a good one, I think, Kevin, although the best retail politician available to them is Andy Burnham. I don't think number 10 are phoning him every week to ask him to help. But he is, Burnham is in comparison to anybody else actually within the Labour Party, I would say is the best communicator that they've got. And
Absolutely.
if you look at someone to give Farage a run for his money, Burnham would be the man. But just very quickly now, before we move on to our next topic of conversation, the one thing that I'm concerned about, you've touched on immigration, Joe. The money that was announced in terms of spend, as I say, NHS, defence, education got a bit, housing got a bit, energy. But that prison crisis ain't going away. And obviously they have announced some new prison builds, but that will take some time. So there's going to be issues around the early release programme and so on. Foreign Office have taken a hit. So I wonder, Kevin, you've got the police agitating now, saying we're not going to have enough bobbies on the beat and all that sort of stuff. My soft advice to police chief constables across the country might be, don't sit lots of coppers in cars with cameras catching motorists doing 30 in a 20-mile zone, but that's just my personal opinion. Kevin, difficult for them, but how is Yvette Cooper feeling at the moment?
Yeah, well, I don't know, and I don't know how much he listens to her husband on his podcast with his views of how the spending.
I wouldn't have thought much, to be fair.
Not a lot. Probably avoid. I think I'm feeling some pain about your speeding fines here, Frank. But I tend to.
Do you know what? To be fair, I haven't had one for a time, but it does drive me mad when I'm driving past every morning, seeing the coppers were, on roads which aren't particularly dangerous, and then they complain about lack of resource. But as I say, that's just a little moan from the McKenna household. Yeah,
well, but I think I'd relate your point about police also into councils, because there's a related part in terms of funding and precepts and all of that. I think that's probably, going to, and it touches on immigration as well, of course, particularly in terms of housing, or, quoting, I don't like using the phrase, but let's just use it, illegal immigration. I think that's probably going to be one of their main domestic challenges coming out of the spending review, not having the money in place for that, the money going into various other things, even though we all know probably health and defence are going to eat up that money like there's no tomorrow. It's not like they're going to have spare cash at the end of it, is that, they will use it and use it again. I think the real problem is going to come on the front line, be that policing or be that the kind of services that councils deliver, which of course includes social care, including adult social care, including having to look after people who come to this country through whatever means, who find themselves without housing. I think that's going to be a challenge, which is also another good reason, I think, to use your council leaders and your combined authority mayors in a more strategic and joined up way. Although I know they meet, they're in number 10 all the time, etc. There's a lot better communication and they're sort of taken more seriously, I think, than any other government has. But I'd be using them a little more strategically. I think the big problem here, just to go on my little rant, my rant is sort of in parallel to your sort of Farage rant in a way, Frank, is that I just don't think this government has enough proper conversations with the country about the challenges it faces without being you don't have to use the £22 billion, hole every time. You don't need to blame the Tories every time. But the challenges that we face, be those drugs, which the police are trying to deal with, is like a challenge you can't ever get on top of, like illegal immigration coming into Kent or wherever else. The tax basis that this country has is not really enough to fix the post-2008 stagnation that we're still experiencing, and which has been topped up by Brexit and the challenges of Russia, etc. There are not enough grown-up proper conversations that this government has with the country to say, look, we face enormous challenges. We don't need to throw stones around about whether any individual politician or party is responsible for these things, but these are some of the fundamental challenges we face. Here's a question: do we want to invest in skills, changing our planning system, having renewable energy, etc.? If so, it's going to cost us more. Where does the burden come? And you could relate that to all kinds of other questions, be that about drugs or about immigration or about the skills challenges, the worklessness, the enormous welfare bill that we've got that's not really, dealing with the disabilities and pensions that we need to service. the government is not having those conversations. So as we started this podcast, Frank, we're giving Rachel Reeves a lot of credit for investing in long-term, spending and infrastructure and so on, which we'll see a lot of this week. But we're not really investing in moving away from the sort of division and the soap opera. I think Joe's right on the soap opera point. Moving away from lots of division, fueled in particular by social media and some parts of the institutional media, and just by a sense of sort of not knowing either where the country is or how we're going to deal with the big challenges. We need to move politics on to a different level. I thought there's really is my finishing point, Frank. I thought, like you, I think Starmer has had some good phrases, and he's used the phrase about wanting to take politics out of people's lives a little bit. That too many times we've been politics has dominated ministerial sackings and Brexit and Liz Truss and all the rest of it. He wanted to take politics out, so politics was there to serve, and we all just got on with our lives. And I agree with that fundamentally, but we've got big challenges, and I don't think really we've had the sort of kind of big conversations and big debates without it being a sort of party, stone throwing exercise that those big debates and those big challenges deserve.
Okay, let's move on to another announcement that was made towards the latter part of last week, and it was the grooming gangs scandal. And Starmer has said now we're going to have a national inquiry. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. However, those were the calls that were being made almost 12 months ago, and the government resisted it robustly, saying that we'd already had enough inquiries. What we needed to do now was crack on and implement the recommendations. And I had some sympathy for that argument. I did at the time sense that politically it wasn't the most savvy thing to do, but nevertheless it was probably the right thing to do. Kevin, what's changed?
Well, he's had the best sort of task force reviewer in the land, Louise Casey, tell him that it's required, and seemingly we'll know more on this afternoon. Seemingly she's also changed her mind. It does. I think it is, as you touch on, it hits the spot exactly as to what Starmer's challenge is, because probably from a legal, of course, from a managerial point of view, he was probably right. That you've got 200 odd recommendations sitting in one or two different reviews, which had not been implemented by the past government or indeed implemented yet by this government. And what is the point of having another review if you've still not implemented the things that most people agree should be done? I also think there's a challenge because I don't know, I've lost count of how many public or national inquiries this country currently has. And on the flip side, you've got things like the post office scandal, which have still not been wrapped up, or the blood scandal, etc. There's loads of massive injustices, which there's a report to say there's been an injustice and there needs to be some justice deployed, and that justice, compensation or whatever else, has not been deployed. And there's all manner of other inquiries going on that even us political nerds can't remember. So I think that is a problem, and any public inquiry will take an awful lot of time because you've got to have evidence and everyone's got to be represented and there's got to be due process and all the rest of it. No problem with any of that. But these things take time. The Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War is a case in point. Actually, it did very good work and came out with a very good report, but everybody got immensely frustrated it took so long because these things take a long time. So on a managerial, legal sort of delivery point of view, he was probably right. But you're right, Frank, of course, that he didn't read the political runes of the time. You had Elon Musk, Farage, Rupert Lowe, Jenrick, even Kemi Badenoch jumping on the bandwagon on an issue none of them had taken a blind bit of interest in before, but suddenly it became interesting to them. They weren't really interested in the people involved in this, the victims of these terrible crimes. And Daily Mail, all the rest of it, jumped on it. And he didn't sort of read where the sort of the politics and the emotions were. He couldn't balance off. We've got to deliver for victims, and we've got to correct whatever is going on in society that leads to these situations. With the feelings and emotions that go through the country, and the sort of political game playing that was going on by some characters, some of whom are not even based in this country. So I think now. It seems, we'll know more later today, it seems that there is going to be a national or public inquiry, but that's also going to, part of his job is to stitch together the local inquiries, which are either up and running or about to go up and running. So maybe that's a a reasonable sort of compromise to some degree. But I think he looked a little bit too sort of against a public inquiry. He looked as if, and it's not fair on him, given his work as DPP, it looked as if he was not taking the issue seriously enough. And that's going to come back to haunt him, I think, this week, and Yvette Cooper pretty badly. And so it's a lesson in politics, isn't it? That sometimes it isn't logical managerialism which needs to, win. Sometimes you've got to, as Blair was brilliant at doing, and Farage, I'm afraid, is brilliant at doing, is sort of finding the sweet spot in a country, and where a country feels that something needs dealing with, or something is terribly wrong, and the government's, batting it off. It's politics v managerialism, isn't it? Writ large, and unfortunately, I think he's going to pay a bit of a price for it this week.
Yeah, it looks like another U-turn, Joe.
No, I don't think it is. I completely disagree. I think he's done it absolutely the right thing. He asked Louise Casey to look at it within 3 months. She's done it. She's come back with a recommendation. He hasn't shilly-shallied around. He said, right, we accept it. I am, like Kevin and like many people, extremely dubious about the value of public inquiries. And when I heard the news, there was a part of me that my heart sank, and I thought the only people who are going to come out of this with anything are lawyers. Now, you're going to have local authorities, children's homes, all sorts of taxpayer-funded institutions tooling themselves up legally to get, weaseling in and out of who was responsible and who wasn't responsible. And the thing about public inquiries is they air what we already know. Some people, and not all the victims of these grooming gangs, want a public inquiry. It's not a unanimous thing, which is another reason that I think Keir Starmer was right to reject it in the first place. And he was right to go back and say to the Tories, but what did you do? And admittedly, the Alexis Jane report was much narrower, but they can't, well, they do, but, they didn't implement any single one of those recommendations. And I think you've got to look at the cost, you've got to look at the time, and ultimately you've got to look at, and who gets blamed, prosecuted, or anything else. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that one of the key recommendations that's come out of Casey is asking the police to reopen their investigations. Now, while the police are banging on about not having any money, they need to actually do the job they're supposed to do, which is not necessarily, looking out for people driving at 32 miles an hour. How could you, Frank? But actually, that's a failure of policing. So that either that's lazy, but is anybody's head going to roll? No. Did anybody get prosecuted for Hillsborough? No. Is anybody going to get prosecuted for Grenfell? I doubt it. COVID? Leveson, you name it. We've had them going back years. They cost a fortune. They missed a trick here slightly, because they could, and previous governments could, use the parliamentary inquiry system, which is not the same as a public inquiry, but it is time limited, but it does have the power to summon people to give evidence. And I think, as a lawyer, Keir Starmer should have been looking at other things. And if he's got any sense at all, he'll say this is going to be concluded within a year or 18 months or something.
But I think I don't think Kevin and I would disagree in terms of the motives, or indeed whether in legalistic terms Starmer was right. And we can look at these things and say, look, these inquiries don't go anywhere. And you've just given a whole list of examples of that, Joe. But let me just read headlines today. Daily Express: say sorry for delay in sex gangs probe. Daily Mail: Starmer in full retreat over grooming gangs. Now, I think you could have wrote those headlines 12 months back. Yeah. If you'd have said to me 12 months ago, well, what we're going to do is we're going to put this in the hands of an independent review to see whether or not we need to have a full inquiry, I'd have said, no, don't do that, Prime Minister, because chances are you're going to end up doing a full inquiry. So let's just go for the full inquiry. It's not necessarily the wrong decision. It's a decision that was made for the right reasons, but politically it's bit him on the arse. Yeah. And I think what Kevin and I are saying is that it's a further demonstration of that lack of political instinct, because I don't think Blair, Johnson, Farage say anything other than we're going to have another national inquiry. And okay, we may all sit here and say, well, what a waste of time. But out in the country, people are thinking, oh, good, something's happening over those grooming gangs.
Yeah.
And if you go back 12 months, and I was very supportive of the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary at the time, the language again was a bit too technical. Why wasn't Starmer and Cooper, for example, coming out and saying, we've had all these public inquiries, there's one going on at the moment over the pandemic. They don't go anywhere. They're a waste of money. We're not going to go down that road anymore. Sell the political message. Instead, they got all technocratic about it. Well, there's these recommendations and they haven't been implemented. Well, people don't understand or appreciate that. Who was the Labour politician who came out immediately and said we needed another inquiry? Andy Burnham.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where my problem is with this decision. Not the fact that it wasn't done for the right reasons, but politically, it's damaged the government again.
Well, I think it has damaged it. And I think the person who's actually come out, although she's escaped much of the blame at the moment, is Jess Phillips, you know, who's always been on the side of the victim. She's been prepared to, you know, put her mouth, you know, to say what she thinks, put her money where her mouth is, and those sort of things. But there she is. It's her ministerial responsibility. She hasn't even set up one of the local inquiries yet. So yes, I completely agree with you. You know, in political terms and in media terms, he could have said, yeah, we'll have a public inquiry, but I'm going to ask Louise Casey to look at what we need to look at, and it would have gone away. But it, you know, it goes back to what you were both saying earlier. The level of hatred towards this government from the press is something I've never seen in all my years as a journalist and in politics. It's just astonishing. You know, if he came back from the G7 with free money and milk and honey and diamonds and gold for everyone, they'd still find something to snipe about. It's awful. It's and you just think, where's it coming from?
Well, I think you mentioned Levinson, so that might be a clue there. Yeah. And a nice segue, though, from Jess Phillips into Birmingham and West Midlands politics, which I do want to get an update on, because Jim's obsessed with the Northwest, despite the fact that he doesn't live here anymore. You often give us a flavour of what's happening in Kent. We don't very often talk about the West Midlands as much as we ought to, so it's great to have Kevin with us today to give us an update. And of course, the big concern that we've all got elsewhere in the country for you, Kevin, and anybody operating in and around Birmingham, is the fact that you got rats the size of tigers. So tell us about how the bin strike is going. And I jest, but honestly, some of the headlines around that were incredible. And I also wanted to get your take on how the Combined Authority and the new mayor are getting on, because they had some great news actually in that spending review this week. So let's start with Birmingham City Council. On a serious note, listen, here we have a local authority that got itself into financial difficulties, not all of its own making. A lot of it was to do with equalisation of pay, and subsequently that's then ended up with the council falling sadly into bankruptcy, and commissioners are now in place. New managing director in situ since earlier this year. That's Joanne Roney, a good friend of Downtown in Business, of course, from a time at Manchester City Council. And this bin strike. Kevin, we've been in Birmingham for 10 years this year, would you believe, September. I can't remember a time when you didn't have a bin strike. So just tell me what's going on. Give me the latest news.
Well, I have to reveal exclusively on this podcast, I've seen neither rats nor tigers.
Kevin!
I know. I mean, I know you will both be in disbelief that the media headlines don't quite accord with the reality in quite the same way. But now that may be just because I stride the streets of the city centre far more than I do some of the other parts. And of course, let's not take anything away. There is, you know, a minor crisis going on. One which is real in terms of an environmental mini disaster, let's put it that way, and one in terms of sort of politics and media. And there are many good things going on, as you referenced. Quite a good spending review for the West Midlands in terms of investment in transport and other things coming out last week. And the city is buoyant. Frank, you visit here often. You know that we've got a very vibrant business community, particularly in a number of key sectors. And the cranes are up and about, and there's lots of development going on. But most of the headlines you will see will be about rats in sacks and all the rest of it. I think can I give you a prediction as to when this dispute, which, as you say, Frank, seems endless or at least recurring, is going to be over? I can't, because we've got the protagonists in the council and the United Union, which don't seem to be able to see anywhere near the same space or landing territory for a deal. And really, it's a pretty small beer in the grand scheme of things. We're not talking about masses and masses of people. We're talking about particular categories or grades of workers where the dispute exists. So it is, at the moment, it's a failure of leadership. There will be some who will say that because we've got commissioners into the city council, the council itself can't exercise full control. There's a degree of truth in that. And we'll have seen with interest the headlines around the United Union and its previous regime and spending in recent times. I'm not entirely sure that they are looking after their interests of their workers 100% rather than playing some of the politics of it. Anyway, whichever way it is, this situation needs to resolve. Because people need the bins emptying for goodness sake, and we need the streets to be clean. But secondly, as you allude to, we can't have this dispute and the sort of fantastical headlines that come out of it blur what is going on in the city, a city of, like many other cities, with great challenges, but also with lots of success stories and great opportunities. So it's not quite as bad as you might imagine from some of the headlines, but my God, there's a challenge, and of course, as you allude to, Frank, there's certainly still an ongoing wider challenge with the city council's reset.
Yeah, the reputational damage is what city leaders, civic leaders and business leaders are concerned about, because, of course, it's a place which is looking for and, in fact, getting lots of investment, not simply from the government, but from financial institutions as well. And if you've been to the West Midlands recently, you're right, Kevin, HS2 alone, the number of cranes that are in and around the place because of that development is significant. But then you have some fantastic things happening in the city centre of Birmingham, such as the Paradise Project. And it's a great city, and it's a shame that those negative headlines are tainting some of the great successes that we've seen during the decade that we were there. And of course, it's all down to Downtown and Business. Have we not launched?
Absolutely. All down to you personally.
Ago. And you will remember, I think, Kevin, that we launched on the same day as, it was a mistake from our perspective, but we did our launch event, Joe, on the day that the brand new John Lewis at New Street Station was opening up.
Oh, good, lots of people.
So there are 4 people at our event and thousands of people at the John Lewis event, but we're still here and John Lewis is shut.
Well,
so
there you go. See? Yeah, absolutely.
Let me get your
Never
take,
knowingly undersold.
Never ever will either. Maybe if Keir was a bit more of a salesman, hey? Kevin, let me ask you about the change in leadership at the combined authority regional level, because again, we've seen a big change, not just in terms of political party from Tory to Labour, but also in terms of the personality, because Andy Street, ubiquitous, very lively, very charismatic, high profile, and Richard Parker, who we've done an event with, very, very good. Kevin, you interviewed him at our event, and I think we both agreed afterwards, good, solid performance, sort of started to map out his plan. It was relatively early in his tenure as mayor, but he's not got that same sort of profile, and you would probably put him in the same category as a Starmer or a Reeves. I know he's very close to the Chancellor, actually, personally. He's a bit of a technocrat. How is that being met by the wider West Midlands electorate, or people not really noticing the change?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the great population of the West Midlands notices or cares that much, because, as Joe touched on earlier, they're more interested in things around their lives, their families, their workplaces, the kids' schools, etc., the local football clubs, whatever it is. But I think, yeah, of course, there are people who will say that we don't have the Andy Street sort of performing on platforms as he did for 2 terms. He played a sort of a role in a roundabout way, sometimes not enough, I thought, in terms of national politics. He was, the Tories' most successful individual politician in terms of his mandate for his period. And, as we talked about with Blair, Farage, etc., a fantastic communicator. There is no doubt. But I suppose if Richard Parker was here, he'd say, well, let's look at the results and let's look at what's delivered. And as you say, he's got a very good relationship with Rachel Reeves. I'm sure that's not the only reason, but he's got a pretty good outcome from the spending review last week. He's delivering those tram extensions, the sports quarter development, the tramway all the way through to East Birmingham, etc. I mean, those things are pretty important. And there's other things he's got out of the spending review. He's delivering the next round of devolution. He's just finished the consultation of his growth plan for the region last week. So I think he is more of a delivery orientated politician. I think he is certainly doing a much better job. I know he spends an awful lot more time dealing with the other leaders, the 7 council leaders, dealing with officers and so on, to get the plans to stack up and to execute his plans. He's got the bus franchise system through, or at least the approval for that, and the process in play to bring that back under public control, much like Andy Burnham. So I think you're right. He is quite similar to Starmer in that sense, as he revealed to you and I at that session you talked about, Frank. He uses the same performance coach as Keir Starmer, which might tell you a lot. So, but it's not all about performance. I'd like there to be more performance. I'd like to see him on more stages. I'd like to see him. The West Midlands is a big region in UK terms, an important region in economic terms, and therefore its political leader should be on the national stage a little bit more, I think. And I think all regional mayors should not shy away every time from saying something different to what the government of the same colour is saying. Andy Burnham doesn't have that problem, obviously, but I think a few of the mayors, they need to stand up for their region and make sure that they're not always thinking about not making their national leader annoyed that they've stood up. But that said, in the end, it'll be about delivery, won't it? As we started this podcast on national terms, and I think on many areas he's touching on that. I do think the growth plan that they've just finished consultation on, that's obviously going to be at the heart, along with housing and skills. That's going to be at the heart of what he can deliver. So early days. A very different kind of mayor, a different kind of approach, different kind of personality, but he's beginning to, put in place some of his key plans. There's no doubt about that.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the BBC chose to interview Andy Street a couple of weeks ago about the bin strike, and what came across was he loves and cares about Birmingham. He wasn't going to take sides on the dispute. He put it into context like you did. There aren't cats the size of rats the size of elephants. It's a small part of the city. It's up to the council and the union. But he talked up Birmingham, just like Andy does about Manchester. And you just think, what comes away from it? You listen to it and you think, oh, I wish I lived there, or I wish I lived there. You don't get that sense listening to Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves thinking, oh, I wish I lived in England. Oh, bugger, I do.
Yeah. Well, as I say, Kevin said that, we are in Birmingham regularly, and the place isn't streaming with rats. Quite the opposite. It's streaming with cranes and good investment, great hospitality venues, and no, it's a city on the up, and definitely, Kevin, room for optimism in terms of the future of the West Midlands, and that spending review won't do them any harm at all. Right, well, listen, great to have your company today. We're going to be back tomorrow talking all things geopolitics, and much going on, of course, in the world, not least the Israel-Iran conflict, but of course things are never quiet in the United States these days. and we have a G7 summit coming up. So if you've enjoyed today, join us again tomorrow. We'll be looking at those subjects more besides, I'm sure. But in the meantime, have a great 24 hours, and we'll see you again tomorrow.